Welcome to the Forward Party podcast. It used to be simpler. Political identity was often tied to party, place, or even family tradition. That's not really true anymore. Today, how people see politics and themselves politically is shaped by what they watch, who they trust, and the communities they're part of. We're joined by John Avlon, journalist and political analyst, and Khalil Ekulana, former NPR host and community storyteller. Welcome, John Avlon.
Thank you. Good to be with you guys.
Great to have you today. So, John, we just saw one another recently at a conference, and you were moderating a panel on some of our kind of governing norms. We were talking about things like the filibuster. We were talking about term limits in the judicial system. Really interesting discussion about those issues. I was surprised that three of the experts, the academics on stage, all were in agreement that we should abolish the filibuster. What was your reaction to that? I was surprised.
Well, I took it as being more of a consensus around mend it, not end it. I think there's a clear recognition rooted in reality that the filibuster is being abused. I think Ted Johnson pointed out that the roots of the filibuster were particularly to block civil rights legislation in the mid 20th century. Not the roots, but the sort of first abuses of it. But I still think that there's we want the check and balance that says that 51% doesn't make a supermajority. I think the key for me is just making sure that you can't check off a box and kill something procedurally and raise the threshold unilaterally. But if you want to filibuster something, Mr. Smith goes to Washington and take the stand on the floor to draw attention to your cause and to try to reason it that way. But right now, it's just become obstructionist. But I do think the impulse to get rid of it, particularly which parties argue for when they are in power, is actually dangerous to our system.
Yeah, they always seem to have short-term memory loss as soon as the majority flips as relates to the filibuster.
Yes. Well, it's the death of the politics of the golden rule, and it's going to be more difficult to rebuild. But fundamental to a democracy is thinking, treating other people like you'd like to be treated, which is imagine you're not in power all the time. Shocking idea, and conduct yourself accordingly.
Good advice. Good advice for anybody in the political system. But it's hard to see that happening these days as the parties get more and more dug in and the divide becomes bigger and bigger. But that's what we're trying to address with Forward. How do you see what we're doing as being relevant to today's discussion?
I think what Forward is doing is really important for a number of different reasons. One, I recently interviewed on my How to Fix It podcast a guy named Dan Cantor who is trying to make a cause out of fusion voting, which is something that existed normally in America until the two parties sort of squeezed it off, which is to say there were opportunities for multiple parties to endorse candidates. We have it in New York, still one of the outliers. And I think a place like Forward that highlights reform candidates, it plays a really important role. I also think in our deeply polarized partisan system that there's a real place for a third party to create an off-ramp for people who just can't get stuck out of that feedback loop between the parties and view them as equally extreme, which I would argue they are not. But so you see independent candidates running for Senate right now in Nebraska and Montana. I think that's very healthy. We need an off-ramp from this vicious cycle of hyperpartisan polarization. It's killing our country. It's exactly what the founders warned about. And I think Forward can play a really important role in depolarizing our conversation and offering people an alternative.
Yeah. So in the last election cycle, we endorsed people who were Democrats who embraced our value, such as yourself, and we endorsed Republicans who also endorsed our principles, and a few independents and a few Fordists, because we were only on the ballot in a few states. In this round, we're actually seeing such a volume of independent candidates, of very high quality independent candidates, that we've actually been focusing on forward candidates and independent candidates. People like Seth Bodnar in Montana interest us very much. Certainly we've been interested in Dan Osborne in the past. We have any number of independent gubernatorial candidates around the country who are making history, I think. So things are evolving for us. We're still looking to have friends in the two major parties, and perhaps woo people to come over. Like Kevin Kiley just became an independent, and we're excited to see that, and excited to work with him. But it's interesting that there seem to be more and more people who are willing to step out of their political identity, which has been a really difficult thing for people to do in the past. Do you feel like identity is getting a little looser for some people?
Well, I think you need to put it in a little bit of perspective. I mean, I think the most recent Gallup poll has 46% of Americans self-identifying as independents. That's double what the number of self-identified independents were, 25 years ago. It's happened precisely at a time as the parties have gotten more polarized. So a lot of Americans feel frustrated, politically homeless. And what I think you're seeing is more folks say, I'm going to get in the arena and follow my independent instincts rather than joining a party. I think it really matters what state and what office you're running for. I think, executive office, independent candidates make a lot of sense. As Fiorello LaGuardia famously said, there's not a Republican, Democrat, or socialist way to clean a street. It's a non-ideological and essentially nonpartisan job, which is why you've got 83% of cities that have some form of open primary or nonpartisan elections. New York being an outlier from that. I think in the Senate, independent candidates could work. Currently we have Angus King, who was a two-term independent governor of Maine, one of the few two-term independent governors we've had in our recent history. He affiliates with the Democratic Party because in this environment, someone who he sees as fiscally responsible and socially tolerant doesn't fit within Trump's Republican Party. And then you've got Bernie Sanders on the other extreme. As you all know and have worked towards, I think the idea originally hatched by Charlie Whalen was a fulcrum strategy where independent candidates might be able to form a coalition or unite the center right and center left to stop the polarization and hyperpartisanship that's killing the chambers. And that's beyond laudable. But I also think you need to take a look at what has worked with independent candidates in the past. In my very, very first book, Independent Nation, we had three independent governors in the 1990s, Lowell Weicker, Jesse Ventura, and Angus King. Only Angus was a two-termer. But you had people with really big name ID, celebrity, political experience, or self-funding, or some combination of the three. And the challenge has been there hasn't been an apparatus behind them almost by definition.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it becomes a one-off. And that's one of the things I think Forward is in a position to help fix. If you're running for Congress or the House of Representatives, I think, it doesn't make a ton of sense to run as an independent because of the way the House works in particular. Now, that may change if we've got enough folks to form an effective fulcrum. But I think it's really about the office and being realistic about what's worked in the past. But the good news is they're surfing off a rising wave. You've got a plurality of Americans who identify as independent, a majority who say they want a third party, and it's quality candidates in the right circumstance that takes that from a dream to something more deliberate and real.
Yeah. Something that differentiates Kevin Kiley, the new independent in the House, from other independent candidates in the Senate in the past is that he's said very openly that he does not intend to affiliate with either the Republican or the Democratic Party, which I think really presents an opportunity for us to find fellow travelers for him and finally build that fulcrum that people know could work. Especially in this closely divided congressional environment, it would only take a few people to be genuinely independent to have a huge impact on our governance.
Mathematically, I think that the Senate, the math is even more compelling right now. The Republicans only have a 1 vote margin.
Yes.
So certainly that's a fact. And he's helped by the fact they've got top 2 in California. And it's an overwhelmingly blue state. And so, sometimes where you stand is a matter of where you sit. But I think it's always good when people declare their independence and follow their conscience rather than walking in lockstep with a political party that doesn't represent them. A lot of good people get effectively corrupted by the partisan economy. I think we're seeing it to absurd lengths with Donald Trump, where the center right keeps getting winnowed down unless they're just the first to fold. Don Bacon being an honorable example. But the more we can form coalitions in the center right and center left to try to recenter our nation, reunite our nation, I think that's the larger game. But I do think it's also important to say that political perceptions aside, and they're rooted in real problems, we have asymmetric polarization. The Republican Party is much further right than the mainstream of the Democratic Party right now. That's not to say the Democrats don't have their own issues, particularly in really blue patches, where you get into that problem of closed partisan primaries being dominated by the most activist wings. But there's no parallel to Donald Trump in the Democratic Party right now.
Well, I think when we go back to the question of political identity, John, you're outlining the importance of what kind of a seat an independent candidate is running for. Are they running for a House seat, a Senate seat, an executive seat? But as we talked about California, the where they're running is really important as well. If you look at a Seth Bodnar in Montana, as we discussed, or a Dan Osborne in Nebraska, these are decidedly red states, but they do have rising registration numbers of independents. And when you think about political identity and these extremes that we're talking about, I wonder if you think that it is an easier, transition for a voter to make from a political identity perspective to vote for an independent versus someone who was an independent in a red state like Montana or Nebraska voting for a Democrat, or similarly in Kevin's instance, a Democrat in a new gerrymandered district voting for Kevin as an independent, as opposed to if he was still running as a Republican. Is that an easier transition from a political identity perspective for people to make?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was trying to say about the need for an off-ramp from the polarization. If people, particularly in deep red states, feel that, that their stereotype of the Democratic Party in their mind is super far left activist class, sort of scolding, then they're going to have a hard time pulling that lever. Right. But an independent candidate creates an off-ramp from that false duality. And I think it is more, compelling for folks. But because we've got Christine Todd Whitman here, I'll also point out something, which is that, recently, and this goes on to today, but even back to Governor Whitman's time, is that some of the most popular governors in our country now and, a decade ago tend to be Republican governors in blue states who have no future in their national party.
This is true.
But, whether it's Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan, Phil Scott in Vermont. So I just think that's an important level set, because possible exception of Kansas, you don't have a ton of opposite examples. But in a state like Massachusetts, which is actually plurality independent, despite liberal Massachusetts stereotypes, you see, and Maryland, which is pretty deep blue, and Vermont, certainly, you actually see that centrist Republicans can get supermajority support. And those are exactly the kind of people in a healthy political system who would be looked to run for president. But the Republican Party doesn't give them the time of day, treats them as freaks and outcasts. And so that's an interesting dynamic about how it's an evidence of asymmetric polarization. But I do think particularly in deep red states, independent candidates create a permission structure. And of course, I wrote a book on Washington's farewell address, and not only did he primarily warn about the dangers of what we would call hyperpartisanship, but he was an independent as a matter of principle. And the Constitution doesn't mention political parties. So that's always important to remind folks, particularly as we celebrate a big national anniversary. The parties were never supposed to be the purpose of our politics. And that's part of how we've gotten in this mess.
That's a wonderful quote.
Yes. No, but
I think we're going to put that on a bumper sticker.
There you go.
There you go.
The creator of bumper stickers. No,
well,
it is true. And The problem we face too, frankly, is that we just aren't teaching civics anymore in our schools. And so many people don't understand that. They don't know that. They don't realize that this was never how our founding fathers envisioned the political process working within the structure that they created. And it's hard to get people to understand that, no, this is what we're trying to do is allow for a revitalization, as it were, not going back, but just a revitalization of the changing.
Yeah. And the timing is right.
And the timing is right.
Our 250th anniversary as a nation was a great time to get people refocused on what the founding fathers actually imagined, and to broaden the scope of quotes that we hear from our founding fathers to ones that include John Adams and his horror at the idea of two strong political parties in America.
Well, the founders warned about the dangers of a demagogue more than anything else. And they warned against people effectively putting party over country, because that was how democratic republics had failed and fallen in the past. That was the lesson they took from the English Civil War, which loomed large in their imaginations. And I'll just say to Christy's point about civics education, I could not agree more. That's fundamental. We need to restore civics education. And one really simple way of doing it, and something I've been banging on about for a while, is to have every graduating high school senior take the same naturalization exam that new citizens do.
No.
Wow.
Just as a level set. Take it as many times as you want, as you need to. But this is something that can unite us and also subtly remind us that it's often new immigrants to our nation who are the most patriotic and the most civically informed. But that's a baseline. And that's something that just, has the advantage of having compelling common sense behind it.
Well,
Let's
John,
start there.
Love that.
John, you have not only are you constantly coming to us with ideas and innovations at Forward, but really you've been such a movement leader for all of us. There are many organizations that we share this space with who have a shared spirit, from No Labels to Unite America and Issue One, With Honor, Braver Angels, all these wonderful groups. And you constantly bring us all together in service of something bigger and larger. And you oftentimes give us language for that movement, John. So we're incredibly grateful for that. And we are going to bring you back for more language for this movement, specifically bumper stickers. So
anytime, we're in it together.
Thank you, John Avlon.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Take care. Be well.
Bye.
Well, it's always wonderful to have John Avlon around to talk about our movement as a whole and what that means for political identity. And so much of political identity right now is certainly driven by the media and how we as Americans are experiencing the media. There's been massive shifts, obviously, over the last 20 years. And so I'm really excited that our next guest is here to talk to us about the media, trust in media, and how that actually has an impact on our collective political identities. So Khalil, welcome. Welcome to the Forward Party podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So we talk oftentimes as builders of a new political movement and a third party about the imagination gap right now that many Americans have, in the idea that what is kind of the art of the possible? What would it look like to have a new political party? What would it look like to introduce competition to allow for a more functional and representative government? And you are an extraordinary storyteller, and a lot of what we are wanting to accomplish requires the telling of stories. So would love to hear from you about how we can invoke storytelling and the media in showing the American people what a new path forward could look like.
Well, I have a mentor in broadcasting who used to say, facts come from data. There's a lot of data-driven media storytelling, a lot of data-driven journalism, and it's great. He said, facts come from data. Anecdotal evidence and lived experience often tell the truth. And I think that's the turn we have to really take. It's starting to hear from people. Every individual American has a different story. What are there? Over 300 million Americans right now currently in the country. That means there's 300 million different versions of America. Let's take time, even within family members and in close-knit groups, people view the country differently. I think it's opportunity for us to take the time to try as much as possible to hear everyone's story instead of adhering to the tenet of generalizing and grouping people together.
Mm-hmm.
Folks, there's no group, quote unquote, any demographic group that exists in a monolith. And we take away people's agency. We take away people's opportunity to be imaginative. You talked about that imagination gap. I also think it's a fear of taking risk as well. It's risky to start something new. It's risky to step out of the paradigm that we've all become accustomed to. And it's kind of obvious that that needs to change. And so I think it's upon media organizations, journalists and media organizations to be a lot more imaginative, to take risks and to find out what each individual's story is and then apply that to the understanding of a particular group.
So Khalil, I love the point that you were just making about that data can tell you part of the story, or at least it can point you toward a problem. But to understand that problem, you have to hear the individual stories. When Governor Romney and I were trying to figure out what to do about the uninsured in Massachusetts 20 years ago, the biggest problem was we couldn't wrap our arms around what the problem really was until we heard those stories. The uninsured was this vast number of people, maybe 700,000 people. But when we actually started trying to hear those stories, to dig down, we found out that some of them were uninsured. Some of them were actually just between jobs. They actually just had a little gap. Some were homeless and had always been uninsured. Some people were young people who, some uninsured were young people who thought they were going to live forever and just didn't want to pay the money. And that actually wasn't good for the system overall to have them out of the system. And so once we started actually hearing those stories and understanding the nuance of why something was happening, not just that it existed, then we could craft a policy that made sense. We could actually craft an answer that fit each of those individual groups' narratives that mattered. So I think you're very much correct that we have to hear those stories in addition to hearing the statistics that are cold and impersonal and often lead us astray.
And do you think?
I agree. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have to hear the stories and then also understand that while our story is most important to us, it is the collection of all of these stories where we could find something that works for everybody. I'm sure you and Governor Romney, when you were working on figuring out what to do with the uninsured, I, as an individual, may want you all to take a particular action that fits my own personal needs. But I have to understand I'm not the only player in this. As what do the kids say? Main character energy. I'm not the only one. And so what can happen if it meets 60% of my goals, 70% of my goals, 85% of my goals? Can I accept that and live with it? And that, I believe, one, is a personal choice, but it's a personal choice we can make when we understand that we're not the only person impacted and that other people have a stake in this as well. And we tend to think of this purely from ourselves, inward out to an outward perspective. And sometimes that's a little selfish. If we're trying to be a republic, if we're trying to be a country and a collective and a democracy, we have to think about others as well as ourselves.
Do you think in today's world that media is helping with that approach, or is it closing it down because of the need to be so quick and to come up with things immediately rather than do the kind of
things
research
that polarize us?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right. And they're being utilized by others.
It could be doing a better job, a much better job. I think we're a long way away from the days of Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow in the media landscape. I believe that in certain levels and places in local journalism, I believe we are getting that. But when it comes to the national legacy news apparatus, we're not getting that at all. And I think it's a total disservice to us. And it's interesting. I'm a broadcaster. I'm in the field.
Right.
And a lot of broadcasters and journalists use the cachet that was earned from blood, sweat, and tears from journalists like Edward R. Murrow and folks 60, 70 years ago. They're using that cachet now, but are they acting in it? And it's something I used to say. I worked at a public radio station for a long time, and we did good work, but I also had to remind my colleagues that it was a business at the end of the day. It was a non-for-profit business. And when the fourth estate is supposed to be this fourth pillar of democracy, can it do that fairly when it has a bottom line to address? And
Wow.
that's a serious question we have to ask ourselves. And yeah, I think it could be doing a much better job. That's why we see the rise of podcasts from all over, from Joe Rogan to Hassan Piker. There are a lot of people who have opinions and broadcast, and it's up to that individual podcaster to determine, are they going to apply the principled journalistic ethics that are involved, that have been, set up this established idea of journalism, but, in some cases, and I'm not going to blame all, but in some cases has kind of fallen to the wayside. And where can people go to news they trust rather than just news that feels good to them in any type of partnership relationship? And that's what it is in being a broadcaster. I am bringing myself into your living room, or you are coming into the studio with me. That is a relationship and a level of trust. Would you rather hear honesty from that person you're dealing with, or someone who just kind of blows smoke and tells you what they think you want to hear? That's not authentic. That's not a true relationship.
I'm really curious about the collapse of local media and how that's impacted our democracy. I on a personal basis, again on an anecdotal basis, I can see in my own hometown that I now have almost no knowledge of or awareness of local issues. I don't, I happen to know the mayor, but if I didn't, I wouldn't, and I certainly don't know anything that he's done in particular, or even what the city council is grappling with. And yet I see the outcome in my town. I look around, so I can judge vaguely. But it used to be only, 10, 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where I would know all their names. I would know every issue. I would see the reporting of each town council meeting and understand the dynamics. People lose something, and they certainly lose trust in their government when it seems to be being conducted in the dark. And do you have any hope that some sort of level of insight into our local governance is going to be provided by media in the future? And what would that look like?
And can I just add on to
Yes.
that question? I just found out, I didn't realize it, but in New Jersey, there are no more editorial boards.
There are no more editorial boards across the whole state.
Yeah, none. There are no more of those editorial meetings where you went and as a candidate and you were challenged, which I always thought was good. I hated them, but I mean, it was good for the people and good for the candidate, good for the paper. There are none, all gone with cutbacks.
And that's a shame. And I think the decaying of local media has come simply because organizations could no longer keep up. Media transitioned, and I think a lot of organizations were slow to get to the switch to digital information. People getting information from their computers, from their phones and their tablets. They were a little bit slow in adapting to that. There's not many places where you can get an actual print newspaper anymore. That's not a big time conglomerate or a legacy media organization. And so it's funding, if you do have a small local media outlet, are they paying as much as maybe the larger corporate competitor? A young person coming out of journalism school, or just a young person coming in, will they take that job? Will they stick around? That is not happening. But there are some places that people can look. There's an organization called States Newsroom. It is a non-for-profit, and they fund local newsrooms across all 50 states of our country. And I think that their emphasis is for free, creating and hiring local journalists and creating story that they share for free with some of the larger papers, with some of the public radio stations that are out there, because they feel it's important for people to understand about the news. I mean, I think every newsroom, every local place should have a beat on education, should have a beat on what is going on in the courts, because it's not just crime that happens in the courts. A lot of times, the cases that are that are again, what's happening in Metro Council with your local government. So you understand not only the moves of the mayor, but the other amounts of elected officials and volunteer boards out there. And then I believe they can have editorial commissions out there, like you're mentioning, Christine. And it's a problem that we have to really begin to face. And will we find the money to invest in this? We say, and this is the thing, I think this is the case with all of the issues we're facing in America. We say it's very important to us, but sorry to sound cliche, are we going to put our money where our mouth is, or our money where our hopes are, our money where our needs are, to really address these and fund these the way we did in the past, but no longer are?
Yeah, and if government's not going to do it, and if the business model isn't, there are the incentives in the business model to do it, institutional philanthropy has the money. And I think, Khalil, you're right. The question is institutional philanthropy going to prioritize this? Because many of the huge, big foundations that we all know have democracy verticals. They're allocating hundreds of millions of dollars to restore and preserve our democratic systems. Is local media one of those core areas that they need to invest in?
Yeah.
So I think you're calling on the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Carnegies of of America to say, yes, do that, invest. It's critical.
Yes. Yeah. And also the Smiths and the Johnsons and people down the street as well. Yeah. There are local, in every community, there's some sort of philanthropy. There are individuals and organizations. It could be the McSmith Bridge Foundation. Are we going to put our money there as well? Is this information good? Because now it seems like information is so valuable, and it's hard for people to trust it when it feels curated.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't feel natural, and suddenly it's like, okay, so where did this who did you talk to? Where did you get this information? Oh, I don't trust the person who funds that. Mm-hmm. Look at how everyone views the Washington Post now that they've made these moves in the past recent months.
I'm a DC resident. It's devastating. It's our hometown paper. And they won't even cover my kids' high school sports anymore.
Yeah. And that's really upsetting to a lot of people. So
especially
how are they covering how are they covering the actual mechanics of how DC itself works?
Yeah. Right.
For those who live there. And it's a disservice to us all. But fortunately, there are still young people growing up who really want to get into local journalism. And there's also I would say, adults as well who are looking to career changes and looking into providing this gap. But again, it's going to take an effort from all of us.
Well, it does.
It's interesting. I think the internet was probably the downfall of the local news systems and many larger papers as well, obviously. But it might be that AI would be able to come in, at least on a local level, and provide summaries and information about some of those local meetings that could take the place in the right hands. So maybe there are business opportunities there after all that could help us get democracy and journalism back aligned.
Potentially.
We were talking to a colleague who's been doing a lot of research about regaining trust in institutions, and the media being one of those. And he said consistently, folks are looking for surprising tables. So bringing together, Khalil, as you say, I don't know if I can trust that source of information because of who funds it. What does it look like to have a really surprising table of people who have different
funders,
different funders coming together with a table? I think is a really neat challenge for folks out there, and an opportunity.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's what we're going to have to come to. Again, not all of us see the issues the same way, similarly. And we don't definitely see this country and what's happening in the world the same way. Are we willing to step off of our literal self-righteous high horses and say, I view this issue this way, you view this issue differently. How can we come together to come to a solution? My grandmother used to always say, do you want to be right or do you want to fix the problem? And I feel like a lot of times most of us want to be right and feign attempts at fixing the problem. Well, if we're going to fix these problems, that means we're going to have a whole lot of different people at the table. I know some folks, particularly in 2020, who were very upset with the wealthy and the elite. And if a wealthy person came to the table, they didn't trust it. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do when you have this great change of our country. There's going to be wealthy people sitting there. If they're willing to help and work on these issues, we have to have them with us as well. And that's something that I really think is beautiful about an independent candidate and the independent party, because it forces you to shift out of the binary idea of Democrat or Republican, conservative versus liberal or progressive, and makes you think outside of that. It challenges your own assumptions so that you can potentially sit down with someone who doesn't agree with you on these issues and come to a solution. That means that's a give and take type of thing. And what that does is that it forces you, metaphorically, to look into the mirror and decide, where are you truly on these issues?
Khalil, that is absolutely so beautiful and concise in terms of what we're wanting to create here. And, you know, we were chatting with John Avlon just a bit ago too, and talking about how John has been so helpful in helping to create language around our movement. And you came and helped us to create language around our movement and challenged us today too.
If I could paraphrase your grandmother, I think our motto would be, do you want to be left or right, or do you want to solve the problem? So,
or do you want to move forward?
Or do you want to move forward? Yes.
So, Khalil, thank you so much for joining us today on the Forward Party podcast. It was wonderful, wonderful to have you.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening today. And if this episode resonated, please recommend the podcast to your friends and family. And we'll see you next time.